Let us start with Damien McDaniel. Bloodshed was nothing new to Birmingham, Alabama. But the wave of violence tearing through the city between July 2023 and October 2024 was a completely different beast. So brutal and deliberate was this streak that by the time investigators began connecting the dots, one particular name kept echoing across crime scenes citywide. This had nothing to do with random luck or heat-of-the-moment rage, nor was it going to wrap up on its own. The allegations were already piling high when Damien McDaniel had just turned 23. Passers-by would have easily mistaken him for just your average young guy trying to get by in Birmingham. Underneath that mask, however, lay a killer systematically wiping people out across the city, according to later claims by prosecutors. A terrifying escalation unfolded as state attorneys eventually pieced the timeline together, beginning with an early morning ambush on a firefighter and culminating in a mass slaughter that tore the community apart. It all dates back to July 12, 2023. Barely 30 minutes into the new shift, at 8:30 in the morning, stands Birmingham Fire Station 9. Settling into their 24-hour rotation were 3 firefighters, pulling off their everyday routines. With the station unlocked, the garage doors stood wide open. 2 gunshots suddenly shattered the quiet of what was just a typical summer morning. Dropping right where they stood were Jordan Melton and Jamal Jones, both uniformed and completely defenseless. While Jones pulled through by a total miracle, Melton clung to life for 5 days before dying in a hospital bed. Immediate leads eluded investigators completely. Though the station captured security footage, the gunman had covered his tracks well. Months would pass before that morning's case could be cracked, yet more bodies started dropping across Birmingham while detectives hunted for clues. On November 27, 2023, 52-year-old Reginald Bryant was discovered dead behind a house on Closure Lane. Right before the gunfire started, bystanders recalled seeing a group of individuals close in on him. A robbery that went horribly sideways was what the crime scene pointed to. Then 2024 arrived, and the killings picked up speed. Just after 2 in the morning on January 10th, 21-year-old Mia Nixon was found dead in her own driveway on Greencrest Turn. A clear motive never surfaced, though detectives later determined she was heavily targeted. Bound for a movie, Christian Norris and Angelea Webster, both 20, left a house in Ensley on February 14th, Valentine's Day. Destiny dictated they never made it. Inside their own car over in the Wylam neighborhood, their bodies turned up 2 days later. Sending shockwaves through Birmingham was the sheer savagery of the double murder, especially since Webster was 5 months pregnant, and police finally began realizing these hits weren't just isolated incidents. On April 9th, Anthony Love Jr. punched out from his shift at the Englewood Lane UPS facility. With no idea eyes were glued to him, he walked out to the parking lot. Prosecutors would later brand his murder a contract killing, an execution carried out in cold blood in broad daylight. Blurry shapes and movement were picked up by security cameras, but unmasking the gunman was going to take time. Then came July 13th, 2024. A horrifying new high was reached as the body count surged. When a birthday bash at the Trendsetters Lounge on 27th Street North turned into a war zone, 4 people were slaughtered and 10 others wounded. Perishing in the chaos were Lorandus Anderson, Stevie McGee, Markeisha Gettings, and Angela Witherspoon, as a hail of bullets flew from the street straight into the packed club. Total pandemonium, screams, and bodies dropping everywhere were what witnesses remembered. Birmingham had not seen a bloodbath like this in generations. That a drive-by shooter had simply opened fire into the crowd without caring who they hit was what detectives suspected. It was later discovered by authorities that the venue was running illegally, completely bypassing basic safety regulations. On August 13th, yet another life was cut short. Another casualty emerged on September 19th, this time at a local bar and lounge. Then came September 21st, 2024. Outside the Hush Lounge in 5 Points South, it was nearing 9 in the evening when gunfire erupted in the heart of one of Birmingham's most popular nightlife districts. Dead were 4 more victims, while 17 others suffered injuries in what would rank as one of the worst mass shootings in the modern history of Alabama. Perishing right there on the pavement were Anitra Holloman, Taj Booker, Carlos McCain, and Roderick Patterson Jr. Absolute panic gripped the entire city due to the massive scale of the slaughter. Quietly building a massive case behind the scenes, Birmingham police connected 18 separate attacks spanning just over a year. Red flags were popping up all over the place. Linking several of the shootings was definitive ballistics testing. Overlapping from one scene to the next were eyewitness accounts, while traffic cameras captured the exact same getaway cars time and again, with Damien McDaniel's name constantly bubbling to the surface. When the task force finally went public with the connection, the mind-boggling scale of the horror was exposed. Directly tied to his suspected killing spree were 18 different individuals. We are talking about 18 human lives, not just 18 incidents. By February 2025, Birmingham police announced they had officially slapped McDaniel with a capital murder charge for the death of firefighter Jordan Melton. This critical crack in the case was what busted the floodgates wide open. Following in rapid succession was a barrage of new charges. Come May, McDaniel stood formally accused of orchestrating all 18 deaths, a staggering rap sheet covering 2 separate mass casualty shootings, the firehouse ambush, the Valentine's Day double murder, and a cold-blooded contract killing plot. Revealed in public statements by state prosecutors was the fact that McDaniel and his crew of hitmen had pulled off nearly 30% of every single homicide committed in Birmingham during that brief window between July and September of 2024. Damning evidence soon began leaking out. Putting him right at the center of multiple crime scenes were reliable eyewitnesses. Turning on him one by one, co-defendants gave detailed confessions that mapped out the various murder plots. Meticulous planning and teamwork were laid bare by digital footprints. To top it off, suspects matching the exact descriptions of McDaniel's tight circle of associates were captured on video feeds. Flat out labeling him the mastermind was the Birmingham police, pointing to a violent rampage that left families broken and the whole community deeply traumatized. Maintaining his innocence through it all, McDaniel steadfastly denied the allegations. Blasting out social media posts from his jail cell, he argued he was the victim of a frame job, that detectives had cooked the evidence, and that an easy fall guy was all the state wanted to close out a pile of cold cases. Proving he had checked in perfectly every month until his bust, he pointed to his clean record with his probation officer, denying any part in the bloodshed, but the state refused to buy it. Counters from prosecutors insisted that the paper trail was airtight and the connections impossible to ignore. Lock in McDaniel's very first trial date for April 6, 2026 was exactly what a judge did at a status hearing in 2025. Heading the docket was a capital murder charge for the bloodbath at the Trendsetters Lounge. Finding 12 unbiased people immediately worried defense attorneys who pointed out that Birmingham had just suffered one of its most violent years on record in 2024, with a staggering 151 homicides, and that McDaniel's face had practically become the poster child for that wave of terror. Admitting it would be tough, the judge warned they could not exactly empty out the county just to find jurors who had been living under a rock. Hanging over the city is a heavy cloud of unresolved grief as McDaniel sits waiting for his day in court. Actively pushing for the death penalty is the state's main objective. Facing either lethal injection or spending the rest of his days behind bars without the chance of parole is his fate if the jury finds him guilty. Still waiting for closure are the loved ones of 18 victims. Waiting for the truth is an entire city. Meanwhile, locked away in a maximum security wing sits a 23-year-old accused of mastermind-level planning behind one of the most ruthless streaks of violence Alabama has ever witnessed. Yet the only horror gripping the state did not belong to Birmingham's dark chapter. In a sleepy, rural town just north of Huntsville, another teenager was about to unleash an act so shockingly evil it would completely shatter everything the locals thought they knew about human nature. Let us move to Case 2. Mason Sisk. September 2nd, 2019. In Elkmont, Alabama, a tiny community of just 500 souls where everyone grew up together, where folks still left their front doors unlocked at night, and where horrific tragedies were things you only watched on the evening news. That was until the nightmare came home. Moody behavior was nothing unusual for a teen, his parents likely assumed, as 14-year-old Mason Sisk was uniquely quiet that evening. Knowing that in just a matter of hours, their quiet country life would vanish in a burst of gunfire and blood was something they had no way of anticipating. Morphing into a complete monster was the young boy they had raised under their very roof. Alongside his dad, John Wayne Sisk, and his stepmother, Mary, Mason had spent his whole life in that house. What looked like a textbook American family had been built by them, rounded out by 3 little kids: 6-year-old Kane, 4-year-old Aurora, and baby Colson, who was still sleeping in a crib at just 6 months old. Everything looked perfectly normal from the outside, but a dangerous tension had been simmering for months behind closed doors. Painting a deeply disturbing picture, later court filings revealed that Mason had previously tried to poison his stepmother by sneaking peanut butter into her food, fully aware that her allergy was life-threatening. Caught stealing her rings was another incident on his record. Swiping a firearm from his grandmother's house was also on the list, and prosecutors noted he routinely took out his explosive anger issues on his little brother. Then that Tuesday night in early September arrived. Just like any other evening, the family turned in for bed. Tucked away in a rural pocket northwest of Huntsville, right up near the Tennessee state line, sat their house on Ridge Road. Countryside like that was the kind of place where folks mostly kept to themselves, leaving the sound of crickets drowning out distant traffic as the only real noise after dark. Around 10 o'clock that night, however, Mason came sprinting out of the house. Flagging down a passerby while totally hysterical, he screamed that something awful had happened inside. Walking into a bloodbath that would haunt them for the rest of their careers was what the first deputies faced upon pulling up. Shot directly in the head while lying flat in their beds was every single member of the Sisk family. John Wayne Sisk, 38. Mary Sisk, 35. Kane, Aurora, and little baby Colson. Executed at point-blank range in their sleep was how each one was found. Wrapped in an eerie, suffocating stillness, the entire house was dead quiet. No sign of a break-in could be found, and absolutely nothing had been stolen. Left behind were just 5 dead bodies and a 14-year-old boy spin-doctoring a story, claiming he was down in the basement playing video games when gunfire suddenly rang out upstairs. Mason spun a tale for police. Sprinting out the door just in time to see a mysterious vehicle peeling away into the dark was what he told them happened. Giving them a highly detailed description, he specified the color, the size, and the direction it fled. Investigators took his word for it for a brief second, but holes in his story started showing up almost immediately. Clashing completely with the physical evidence was his timeline of events. His description of the getaway car couldn't be backed up by a single witness, and zero proof that any outsider had ever stepped foot in that house was found when the forensics unit finished sweeping the crime scene. Hauling Mason down to the station for a formal interrogation was the next move for Limestone County Sheriff's deputies. Unnaturally calm, in fact, he sat there perfectly composed. His alibi began to crumble, however, as the detectives started turning up the heat. Finally, looking at the cameras during a videotaped confession that would later shock the courtroom, Mason admitted to everything. "Yeah, they argue a lot, and I got fed up with it," he muttered. "And the kids were going through a lot." Chilling was such an admission from a kid who wasn't even old enough to drive. Wiping out his entire household was something he did simply because, by his own account, the constant bickering was something he couldn't stand anymore. Throwing the justice system into a massive legal knot were his actions, seeing how Mason was only 14. Automatically pushed into adult court under Alabama state law are juveniles hit with capital charges, yet facing the death penalty is barred for them by the Supreme Court. Whether he was going to pay for what he did was never the issue, but rather how severe that punishment could actually be. Moving forward with the case, prosecutors hit him with multiple counts of capital murder. Pushing back against the state, his defense lawyers painted him as a deeply traumatized child. They argued his confession had been coerced under intense pressure and that he belonged in a treatment facility, not a maximum security prison for life. Dragging out over years was the legal battle. His first trial in September 22 collapsed into a mistrial when a mountain of new data suddenly uploaded from Mary Sisk's recovered cell phone. Turning 18 by the time the dust settled, Mason was no longer a child in the eyes of the law. But he still faced judgment for crimes he committed as a minor. Launching its second attempt in April 23, the state laid it all bare for the jury: the video confession, the gruesome forensics, and the first-hand accounts from the deputies who swept the bloody bedrooms. Brought up as well were the peanut butter poisoning attempt and the stolen jewelry, and the violent threats Mason had leveled at his parents. Walking out to deliberate for a mere 2 hours, the jury marched back in with a decision: guilty on every single count of capital murder. Absolute and unanimous was the verdict. Showing absolutely no emotion as the jury's decision was read aloud, Mason sat stone-faced, leaving his future entirely in the hands of Circuit Judge Chadwick Wise. The court was forced to make a highly unusual legal call. Locking up a minor, according to guidelines set by the United States Supreme Court, for life without any hope of parole, is a punishment that should be reserved solely for the absolute worst of the worst. Weighing a teenager's underdeveloped brain and their potential to change their life around is what the law requires judges to do. Combing through the horrific details, however, led Judge Wise to determine that this case fit that rare, extreme description perfectly. Gruesome, deeply disturbing, and a display of pure, unadulterated evil was how Judge Wise described the slaughter in his official sentencing paperwork. Picked off while lying completely defenseless in their own beds was the chilling fact he pointed out regarding all 5 victims, noting that Mason had calmly walked from room to room, executing his family members one by one. That 3 of those victims were just little kids, including a helpless baby, was heavily highlighted by the court. Vastly more stomach-churning was the horrific nature of the Sisk murders than previous cases where life sentences for minors had been legally upheld. Judge Wise officially handed Mason Sisk a sentence of life in prison with 0 chance of parole on September 7, 2023. Firing off appeals immediately, Mason's defense attorneys claimed the trial was deeply flawed, arguing that key evidence should have been thrown out and that constitutional protections were violated by the harsh sentence. Throwing out their request for a retrial by December 2023 was a judge's swift response, and the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals shot down the challenge in 2024, upholding both the conviction and the sentence. Facing the reality that he will draw his very last breath behind prison bars, Mason Sisk is in his late teens today. Permanently scarred by the tragedy was the tiny community of Elkmont. Though locals put up memorials and hundreds turned out for emotional candlelit vigils, the haunting questions never went away. How does a 14-year-old child bring himself to do something so monstrous? What warning signs did everyone miss? And could anyone have stepped in to stop it? Processing the grief is still impossible for the relatives left behind. Ripped away in a single night by a boy who was supposed to be wrapped in their love and trust were 5 of their family members. Becoming a dark, chilling reminder that real evil rarely gives you a heads up was the legacy of Mason Sisk's name, proving it can mask itself behind innocent, youthful faces and quiet, reserved personalities, and that the most vicious violence sometimes comes from the people we least expect. Wearing far more disguises than anyone cared to admit was what it meant. If a teenage boy could systematically slaughter his entire household, a concept that included the mask of a bitter employee who convinced himself his coworkers were talking trash behind his back. Let us move to Case 3. Alan Eugene Miller. On August 5, 1999, stands Pelham, Alabama. Nestled just south of Birmingham is this quiet suburb, where folks went to their day jobs, raised their kids, and figured the morning backup on Highway 31 would be their biggest headache of the day. Before most people had even finished pouring their morning coffee, that illusion of safety shattered. Working as a delivery driver for Ferguson Enterprises, a local heating and air conditioning distributor, was Alan Eugene Miller. Looking like just another blue-collar worker grinding out a living at 34 years old, he harbored a dangerous paranoia beneath the surface that had been eating away at his sanity. Utterly obsessed had he become with the idea that his co-workers were spreading nasty rumors about him, rumors he couldn't prove, and gossip that likely existed entirely in his own head, according to later court testimony. Real enough to justify a bloodbath were those imaginary slights to Miller. Pulling into the parking lot that Thursday morning, Johnny Cobb, the company vice president, was heading for the front entrance when he heard loud, chaotic noises and someone screaming inside. Bumping right into Miller at the front door occurred before his brain could even process what was going wrong. Gripped in Miller's hand was a .40 caliber Glock handgun. "I'm tired of people starting rumors on me," he muttered, his voice chillingly calm, almost casual. With that, walking away was all he did, leaving Cobb freezing there in absolute shock. Rushing inside the building, Cobb saw the horror become instantly clear. Slumped under a desk was 28-year-old Christopher Scott Yancey. Ripping through his groin and into his spine, the initial bullet paralyzed him on the spot after he was struck 3 times. As Miller walked right up and pumped 2 more rounds into him, he lay there completely helpless and unable to run. Stumbling upon 32-year-old Lee Holdbrooks in the hallway, Cobb found him face down at the tail end of a long smear of blood. Clinging to consciousness by some miracle, Holdbrooks had taken bullets to both his chest and head. Along the floor, he had dragged himself 25 feet toward a nearby exit, leaving a thick, crimson streak. Stepping forward to finish him off with a point-blank shot to the head was what Miller did after simply standing there watching the man struggle. Expanding pools of blood now surrounded the 2 dead men, with 9 spent shell casings left scattered across the floor. Not yet done with his rampage, Miller climbed back into his truck and drove 5 miles over to Post Air Gas, a supplier where he used to work. Tracking down 39-year-old Terry Jarvis once inside, he confronted his former supervisor. Bringing the body count to 3 dead men in under an hour, Miller shot Jarvis 5 times before anyone could even alert the authorities. Lasting not very long was his flight, though he quickly hit the road again. Moving in to arrest him without a fight, an Alabama Highway Patrol trooper spotted his truck pulled over on the shoulder. Inside the cab of the truck, officers recovered the murder weapon. Offering detectives no real motive, Miller simply repeated the exact same grievance he had muttered to Cobb earlier that morning. Those imaginary rumors. Laying out a textbook definition of premeditation, the prosecution proved at trial that this wasn't a sudden burst of rage. Deliberately arming himself, Miller had driven to the first business to execute 2 co-workers before driving to a second location to murder a third. Proving each execution was completely intentional, every single victim had been shot repeatedly. Attempting to mount an insanity plea, the defense team brought in a psychiatrist who testified that Miller was deeply mentally ill and plagued by severe paranoia. Conceding that the condition didn't legally excuse his actions was something the expert ultimately had to do, however. Originally entering a plea of not guilty by reason of mental defect, Miller eventually withdrew it before the trial wrapped up. Convicting him of capital murder in the year 2000 was an easy choice for the jury, given the mountain of eyewitness testimony. Captured on the record were his own self-incriminating words, while ballistics reports linked his gun directly to the scene. Packing Miller off to Holman Correctional Facility to await his execution date, the presiding judge handed down a death sentence. Destined to drag on for decades was his legal saga, as Alabama repeatedly ran into massive hurdles with its lethal injection protocols. Citing corporate and ethical objections, pharmaceutical companies flatly refused to sell their drugs to prison systems. Scrambling desperately to find alternative methods, state officials routinely scheduled and then scrapped execution dates. Facing the needle at last, Miller was moved into the death chamber on September 22, 2022. Failing over and over again, the execution team strapped him down but then spent hours poking and prodding to find a usable vein. Weighing 351 pounds, Miller made it nearly impossible for the technicians to locate an IV line. Running out of time became obvious as the clock ticked dangerously close to the midnight expiration of the death warrant. Calling off the execution allowed Alabama officials to send Miller back to his cell, where he immediately sued the state over the botched procedure. Arguing that the traumatic ordeal amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, he claimed any second attempt with needles would violate his rights. Cutting its losses by November 2022, Alabama reached a settlement, promising never to attempt a lethal injection on Miller again. Pivoting instead to nitrogen hypoxia, the state chose an execution method that had never once been tested on a human being anywhere in the country. Dropping his lawsuit after hammering out a confidential agreement with the state, Miller initially fought the untested protocol in court. Involving forcing an inmate to breathe pure nitrogen gas through a mask, nitrogen hypoxia completely starves the brain of vital oxygen. Depriving the organs of air continues until the body completely shuts down. Insisting it was entirely humane, supporters of the method claimed the inmate would simply drift off into unconsciousness and die peacefully. Blasting it as state-sanctioned torture, opponents pointed out that Alabama had only used it once before on Kenneth Eugene Smith in January 2024. Shaking violently on the gurney was how media witnesses described Smith during that first execution. Gasping for breath and convulsing violently against the leather straps, he caused the agonizing process to drag on for over 20 minutes, triggering immediate international outrage. Miller became only the second inmate in global history to be put to death using nitrogen gas on September 26, 2024. Flat onto the gurney inside the death chamber at Holman Correctional Facility was where technicians strapped him. Securing a heavy mask over his face, they allowed the deadly flow of nitrogen to begin at 6:14 p.m. Muffled by the plastic mask, Miller's final words remained fiercely defiant nonetheless. "I didn't do anything to be in here," he insisted, right before the gas took effect. According to journalist Lauren Gill, Miller visibly fought the process for about 2 minutes, pulling hard against his restraints and thrashing around. At irregular intervals for the next 5 to 6 minutes, he gasped heavily, trying to find air. Turning into deep gasps, his breathing grew incredibly shallow before everything went completely still. Pronouncing him dead at 6:38 p.m., the doctor wrapped up an execution that lasted roughly 16 minutes from start to finish. Assuring reporters later that the execution went exactly as scheduled was Alabama Corrections Commissioner John Q. Hamm, who claimed those violent convulsions were just standard biological reactions as the body runs out of oxygen. Firing back, human rights critics argued that the prolonged gasping proved he suffered immensely. Marking the 1600th execution carried out in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated back in 1976 was Miller's death. Delivering a long-awaited sense of justice after 25 years of waiting, the event finally closed the chapter for the grieving loved ones of Lee Holdbrooks, Christopher Yancey, and Terry Jarvis. Releasing a statement branding the execution as entirely just and proper was Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall, hammering home the point that Miller had never once shown a single shred of remorse for the lives he stole. Far from over, however, was the fierce debate over nitrogen hypoxia. Was this truly a humane step up from lethal injection? Or did the state simply return to cruel, experimental methods that flew in the face of constitutional protections? Stubbornly maintaining his innocence until his final breath, Alan Eugene Miller completely ignored the mountain of evidence and his own self-incriminating words from 1999. Cutting down 3 innocent men was something he did simply because he was convinced they were talking trash behind his back. Finding not a single trace of evidence that those rumors existed, police noted that no witness ever backed up his claims. In the end, the paranoia that triggered the bloodbath lived entirely inside his own skull. Devastatingly real, however, was the fallout from his delusions. Shattering 3 families completely and instantly erasing 3 lives, the crime left behind a dark cloud of violence that would haunt the town of Pelham for a generation. Quite so black and white, yet not every high-profile case in Alabama was. Sometimes the fine line separating the victim from the killer became so heavily blurred that it shook the very foundation of the state's self-defense laws. Let us move to Case 4, Brittany Smith. January 16, 2018, in Stevenson, Alabama. Desperately trying to piece her life back together in this small town nestled near the Tennessee line was 32-year-old Brittany Smith. Newly clean from a methamphetamine addiction, she was a mother of 4, doing everything she could to stay on the straight and narrow. So, when an old acquaintance named Joshua Todd Smith called her out of the blue begging for a favor, hesitating to help was not her reaction. Stranded out in a local park, he was freezing as a heavy snow fell. Plus, picking him up felt like a harmless, decent thing to do since she had just bought a puppy from him the previous afternoon. Plunging her straight into the most terrifying night of her life was that single choice. Brittany and her brother, Chris McCallie, loaded Todd into the car and brought him back to her place on Believer Street. Sitting around, they talked openly about recovery, battling addiction, and the hard road to staying clean, since Todd had his own history with meth. But according to Brittany, turning dark and predatory suddenly was the mood in the room. Todd became violently aggressive, slamming her onto a bed and choking her until her vision went black. Stripped naked and lying in a pool of her own urine when she finally came to, she later testified that Todd repeatedly raped her throughout the night. Swearing he would kill her on the spot if she screamed, he threatened to hunt down her family and kept demanding cigarettes, stomping around the house like he owned the place. Frantically calling her mother because she didn't have a working car, she prompted her mom to immediately send Chris back over to check on her. Soon after, Brittany, Todd, and Chris all piled into a vehicle and drove down to a nearby gas station. Grabbing a scrap of paper the second Todd turned his back once inside, Brittany scribbled his name down. Frantically passing the note to the store clerk along with a terrifying warning, she made it clear, if she turned up dead, this was the guy who did it. Begging the cashier not to call the cops right then, she was absolutely petrified of what Todd would do to her if he caught wind of it. Returning to the house shortly after, they drove back to Brittany's place while Chris immediately circled back to the gas station to grill the cashier, who verified the terrifying note Brittany had left behind. Grabbing a weapon and marching right back to the house to confront Todd was Chris's immediate response, absolutely furious and desperate to protect his sister. Turning physical instantly was the confrontation. Todd locked Chris in a tight headlock and was actively choking the life out of him, according to Brittany's account. Screaming at the top of her lungs for them to cut it out, she snatched the weapon off the counter and pulled the trigger 3 times when they didn't separate. Dropping to the floor was Todd. Though paramedics rushed him to the hospital, pronouncing him dead upon arrival was all the medical staff could do. Dialing 911 herself, Brittany made the very phone call where her self-defense case began to fall apart. Never bringing up the sexual assault when the dispatcher picked up, Brittany omitted the one word that would anchor her entire defense and never mentioned she'd been brutalized. Flat out lying to the police instead, she claimed Chris was the one who fired the shots, thinking she could take the fall to protect her brother. Panicking was her later explanation for this move because she was convinced the police wouldn't order a rape kit exam right away unless they knew for a fact she was the victim. Gathering that forensic evidence before it washed away was her desperate goal. Technically, working was the gamble, as nurses documented more than 30 distinct bruises all over her body, deep bite marks on her neck and chin, clear indicators of strangulation, and bodily fluids matching her assault allegations. Locked into the official police record already, however, was that initial lie, and it would haunt her all the way to the courtroom. Cracking by the very next morning, Brittany admitted she was the one who pulled the trigger. Placing her under arrest immediately, the police slapped her with a murder charge. Going straight to work building a stand-your-ground defense was her legal team, utilizing an Alabama statute that grants citizens the legal right to use lethal force if they genuinely believe they or someone else is about to be killed or severely harmed. Emphasizing that she explicitly warned Todd before opening fire, Brittany's lawyers argued that she was terrified for her own life and the life of her brother, and that believing he was going to murder them both right there in the living room was completely logical. Notoriously difficult for female defendants to win, however, are stand-your-ground immunity hearings. An incredibly small number of women had successfully used the statute in Alabama since it passed back in 2006. Fighting her immunity motion with everything he had was Jackson County District Attorney Jason Pierce. Hammering away at the massive contradictions in her original 911 call, he argued that Todd was the actual victim in the room, not Brittany. Pointing out that state forensic analysts found absolutely 0 traces of Todd's DNA in the swabs taken from her bedsheets, he noted this discrepancy even though they did recover foreign secretions from her actual body. Claiming she had plenty of chances to run away, he argued that deadly force was never justified because her brother acted as an unprovoked aggressor by bringing a lethal weapon into the house. Handing down a 19-page ruling in January 2020, Judge Jennifer Holt completely denied Brittany's stand-your-ground motion. Acknowledging explicitly the severe physical trauma detailed by the medical examiners, Holt noted the heavy bruising, the handprints around her neck, and the deep bite marks. Writing that Brittany had given totally conflicting stories about what went down, she highlighted that initial emergency call and her fake claim that Chris did the shooting. Hammering also on the absence of semen evidence was the judge a routine hurdle in sexual assault cases, but one that severely damaged Brittany's honesty in the eyes of the court. Ruling that Brittany completely failed to prove she had a reasonable belief that killing Todd was her only option was the most damaging blow of all. Crushing Brittany completely, the devastating ruling sent shockwaves through her network of supporters. Rallying quickly to her side, Civil rights and domestic abuse advocacy groups across the nation argued her case exposed massive, systemic biases in how stand-your-ground laws are applied. Backing them up were real-world statistics, showing that male defendants, particularly white men, had a vastly higher success rate using the defense than women, especially women of color or those surviving severe domestic abuse, turning into a massive national flashpoint for debates surrounding self-defense, victim blaming, and the justice system's treatment of survivors was Brittany's legal nightmare. Officially locked in for February 10, 2020, was her criminal trial. Hitting her with a brand new indictment just days before jury selection, prosecutors unleashed a brutal twist: second-degree arson, accusing her of torching a Stevenson mobile home months before the shooting. Inflating her potential prison time to a terrifying degree was the immediate effect of this surprise charge. Surrendering to a plea bargain at last, Brittany faced the very real threat of spending the next several decades behind bars. Entering guilty pleas for both murder and arson on October 9, 2020, she received a 20-year sentence for the homicide alongside a 15-year sentence for the fire. Under the terms of the agreement, serving 18 months in prison, 18 months on house arrest, and then being on probation was her mandated path. Releasing her from prison in May 2021 allowed her to begin her house arrest. Strict conditions governed her release, however, and Brittany struggled to follow them. Taking her children to a trunk-or-treat Halloween event in November 2021 constituted a direct violation of her house arrest. Sending her back to jail for 45 days was the consequence, and in September 2023, she violated probation again, this time for testing positive for substances and failing to complete a court-ordered rehabilitation program. Marking her sixth arrest since her original conviction, this latest bust kept her in the legal system. Featured in a prominent media spotlight was Brittany's story, thanks to a Netflix documentary released in November 20 Tuesday titled State of Alabama vs. Brittany Smith, exploring whether women in the United States have equal access to self-defense protections under the law was the film's core theme. Interviews with Brittany, her family, legal experts, and advocates who argued that the system had failed her were all included. Sparking renewed conversations about Anaya's law and similar reforms was the documentary's main impact, though Brittany's case predated those changes. Remaining under correctional supervision today is Brittany Smith, her life permanently defined by a night she insists was about survival. Continuing to argue she never should have been convicted are her dedicated supporters. Failing her because she was a woman, because she had a history of substance use, was how they viewed Alabama's stand-your-ground law, especially since she made the mistake of lying in the initial 911 call. Countering that the evidence was too inconsistent, critics argued that she could have escaped and that the law was applied correctly. Shot 3 times in Brittany's kitchen, Todd Smith is dead, a fact that remains undisputed. Depending entirely on who you ask is whether that death was murder or self-defense. Doing what she had to do to survive is the only answer that matters for Brittany. Equally clear for the courts was the opposite conclusion. She crossed the line, leaving the case as a stark reminder that self-defense isn't always black and white. Seeing victims the way victims see themselves is something the legal system simply doesn't always do. Raising serious questions about individual violence and survival was the core of Brittany Smith's case, yet the next case removed all ambiguity. Coming not from desperation but from cold ideology was a new kind of evil, and across state lines and years stretched the massive damage it caused. Let us move to Case 5. Eric Rudolph. July 27, 1996, in Atlanta, Georgia, during the Summer Olympics. Gathering to celebrate international competition, unity, and the ideals of global cooperation were millions of people. Bursting at the seams with spectators soaking up the festive atmosphere was Centennial Olympic Park. Around 1:20 a.m., a security guard named Richard Jewell spotted a suspicious green military pack abandoned under a bench near the concert stage. Flagging down law enforcement immediately, he prompted the bomb squad to rush in, only to confirm Jewell's absolute worst nightmare. Packed tight with jagged shrapnel engineered to tear through as many human bodies as possible were 3 heavy pipe bombs tucked inside that bag. Dialed into 911 from a nearby street payphone at 1:25 a.m. came a generic emergency call. There is a bomb in Centennial Park. "You have 30 minutes," delivered a crisp message from a caller whose voice sounded chillingly flat, almost automated, before the line went dead. Frantically beginning to clear the crowds out of the blast zone, officers were completely out of time. Blowing up at 1:27 a.m., the device instantly killed Alice Hawthorne, a mother who had driven all the way from Albany, Georgia, with her young daughter just to experience the games. Shredded by a flying hail of nails, wood screws, and jagged metal shards were over 100 other bystanders, while a television cameraman rushing to film the chaos suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. Morphing into a massive crime scene just like that was the global celebration. Sparing dozens of families from grief was the observant guard, Richard Jewell, who actually found the pack and was celebrated nationwide as an absolute savior during those first few days. Flipping completely out of nowhere, the narrative suddenly turned him into the prime suspect, theorizing openly that he planted the device himself just to bask in the hero's spotlight were the FBI alongside national news networks. Completely ruining his life was the toxic media circus, and months of agonizing investigation would pass before the feds formally cleared his name. Melted away into the darkness all the while had the actual terrorist. 3 more explosions rocked the region over the course of the next 2 years, starting on January 16, 1997, at an abortion clinic over in Sandy Springs, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. Tearing up the building structure, the first pipe bomb detonated at the rear of the property. While paramedics, firefighters, and police officers were actively sweeping and securing the perimeter exactly 1 hour later, a secondary blast ripped through the parking lot, leaving 4 people wounded. Specially rigged to slaughter first responders was this second bomb, a sick ambush tactic that would fast become the terrorists' calling card. Becoming the next target of a double bombing on February 21, 1997, was the Other Side Lounge, a popular nightclub in Atlanta. On this hunt, injuring 5 people was the result when the initial device tore through the back patio, but technicians managed to defuse a secondary bomb before it blew, saving countless lives. Undeniable similarities between all the devices were quickly mapped out by bomb experts, who noted the exact same wiring, identical shrapnel, and the same tactical setups. Executing a cold, highly calculated war of terror was someone out there. Let us look at January 29, 1998, in Birmingham, Alabama, at the New Woman All-Women Healthcare Clinic. Pulling up for their morning shift right around 7:30 in the morning were nurse Emily Lyons and security guard Robert Sanderson, an off-duty Birmingham cop. Near the front door, they spotted a stray package that looked like a standard FedEx parcel. The moment Sanderson bent down to check it out, the device detonated with a devastating shockwave. Dying instantly on the pavement was Sanderson, while Lyons was blasted backward, her body completely shredded by nails and jagged metal shards. Enduring 37 separate surgeries allowed her to survive the blast, though metal fragments remained stuck in her legs for years, and nearly all the vision in her left eye was lost. Catching a massive break this time, however, was the task force. Standing near the clinic that morning happened to be 2 sharp bystanders, Jeffrey Tickle and Jermaine Hughes. Locking eyes on a man behaving suspiciously and sprinting away from the smoke, Hughes gave chase and successfully scribbled down the suspect's license plate. Pointing detectives straight to a pickup truck registered to Eric Robert Rudolph was that quick thinking. Feds instantly linked the 32-year-old resident from Murphy, North Carolina, to the previous Atlanta explosions. Grand juries formally indicted him for the Birmingham attack by February 1998. Slapped with additional charges for the 3 Atlanta bombings come October, he soon found his face plastered on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list on May 5, 1998. Carrying a $1 million bounty, Eric Rudolph had already slipped deep into the rugged Nantahala National Forest of western North Carolina. Outrunning and outhiding one of the biggest, most expensive manhunts in modern American history was what he managed to do for over 5 years. Flooding the region with hundreds of specialized field agents was the FBI's immediate response. Tearing through the mountainous backcountry, they grilled the local mountain communities and locked down high-tech surveillance grids. Seeming to simply evaporate into thin air, however, was Rudolph, a highly trained survivalist. getting regular food and shelter from local sympathizers who backed his radical anti-government, anti-abortion worldview was what many experts suspected. Meanwhile, his immediate family publicly claimed he was being framed. Working his patrol route behind a grocery store in Murphy at 3 o'clock in the morning on May 31st, 2003, a rookie cop named Jeff Postel changed everything. Catching sight of a shadow rummaging around in the trash bins, he moved in. Trying music to duck away was the stranger, but Postel moved in and cuffed him, revealing it was Eric Rudolph. Scavenging for scraps after 5 long years hiding out in the deep woods, he had finally been brought down, giving up without a fight. Noting that tears were pooling in his eyes were onlookers as federal marshals escorted him onto a transport plane bound for Atlanta. Staring down a death sentence, Rudolph was offered a bargain by prosecutors. If he agreed to spend the rest of his life behind bars with 0 chance of parole, pleading guilty to the full sheet of charges was required, along with guiding agents to where he had buried 250 pounds of live dynamite across the North Carolina wilderness. Taking the deal in April 2005, Rudolph used his formal sentencing hearing to blast out a manifesto defending his actions, proudly claiming his bombings were legitimate political protests targeting abortion providers was his main stance, along with attacking what he branded as a global socialist agenda. Nothing more than a giant advertisement for values he despised was what the 1996 Olympic Games were to him, causing him to write off the innocent deaths as mere collateral damage in what he saw as a holy war, showing 0 remorse. Stacking 4 consecutive life sentences on him without the option of parole was what Judge Linwood Smith ultimately did. Packed off straight to ADX Florence, the notorious Supermax facility out in Colorado, was where Rudolph went. Emily Lyons made sure she was sitting in that courtroom for the sentencing, looking directly at the monster who had shattered her body and nearly taken her life, where he is locked away to this very day. Wanting him to look her in the eye and see the agonizing pain he had caused was her stated purpose, along with the endless surgeries she had to endure, and the jagged pieces of metal that remained permanently wedged in her flesh. Completely stone-faced, Rudolph just stared blankly ahead. Rudolph actually tried to file an appeal to overturn his life sentences in 2024, leaning heavily on a recent Supreme Court decision regarding vague sentencing guidelines. Shooting down his request without hesitation, however, was the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, ruling that he was legally bound to the original terms of his plea bargain. Dodging execution was the specific reason he had negotiated that deal, giving up any future right to fight the sentence. Sending an airtight message was the court's primary objective. Inside a prison cell is where Eric Rudolph is going to draw his absolute last breath. Never getting their loved ones back are the families of Alice Hawthorne and Robert Sanderson. Forced to live with deep physical and emotional scars left by his bombs are well over 100 people. Carrying his shrapnel inside her body to this day is Emily Lyons, a dark testament to a movement that claimed to value human life, yet used horrific violence to prove its point, leaving nothing but grief and body bags behind. That sheer stubbornness and a radical ideology can keep a fugitive alive through incredible hardship was proven by Rudolph's 5-year run in the wilderness. But a completely different brand of dark determination was about to surface down in Citronelle, Alabama. Triggering one of the most savage family massacres the state had ever witnessed, this explosion wasn't driven by politics, but by a toxic mix of crystal meth and raw, unbridled fury. Let us move to Case 6, Derrick Dearman. On August 20th, 2016, stands Citronelle, Alabama, a sleepy, rural community sitting about 30 miles north of Mobile. Sprawling plots of land separated by thick woods and deep distance were where folks lived out there. Sleeping soundly was a house packed with family members down on Jim Platt Road, right at the edge of a dead-end dirt lane. 5 of those people would be slaughtered by the time the sun came up, permanently shattering the peaceful quiet of that Saturday morning with an explosion of violence so incredibly vicious that veteran detectives officially labeled it the single worst mass murder in the history of Mobile County. Carrying a long rap sheet out of Mississippi and a notorious reputation for turning incredibly violent whenever he was high, Derrick Ryan Dearman was 27 years old. Desperately trying to break clean from him was his girlfriend, 24-year-old Lynetta Lester. describing their relationship as an incredibly volatile, dangerous roller coaster were close friends and relatives, noting Dearman had an explosive temper, especially when he lost control. Packing up and fleeing to her brother's house in Citronelle was Lynnetta's final move, begging for a safe haven with Joseph Adam Turner and his wife, Shannon Melissa Randall. Busy raising a tiny 3-month-old baby boy was the young couple. Also crashed at the house were Randall's 26-year-old brother, Robert Lee Brown, alongside Randall's niece, 22-year-old Chelsea Marie Reed, who was 5 months pregnant, and her 23-year-old husband, Justin Caleb Reed. Looking for Lynetta on Friday night, August 19th, Dearman banged loudly on the door. Standing his ground, Turner flatly told him to get lost. Circling back to the house all night long, Dearman got visibly more unstable and aggressive with every single trip. Dialing 911 to report that Dearman was stalking, the property occurred around 1 o'clock in the morning when someone inside the house finally called. Rushing to the scene but finding absolutely no trace of him, Citronelle police officers cleared out after sweeping the dark tree lines. Heading back to bed under the belief that the danger had passed, the family was tragically wrong. Heavily out of his mind on crystal meth, Dearman crept back onto the property on foot sometime after 3 a.m. Confessing later to investigators that the heavy drug use made him violently paranoid, he admitted it made him see dark hallucinations that weren't actually there. Snatching a heavy axe wedged in a yard tree, he forced his way past the front door and silently moved from room to room. Right next to their tiny infant son, Turner and Randall were dead asleep in their bed. Ambushing them brutally with the axe while they lay defenseless was Dearman's opening move before slipping into the next bedroom to unleash the same horror on Chelsea and Justin Reed. Targeting Robert Brown came next. Hacked with the axe first was every single one of the 5 victims, and then shot with guns he dragged out of their own closets. Doubling back through the house. After the initial butchery, according to graphic court files, Dearman shot each bleeding victim a second time just to ensure they were dead, locating Lynetta and the infant, both miraculously untouched, only when the slaughter was over. Shaking her awake, he aggressively dragged her outside into the dark to talk. Paralyzed with fear was Lynetta. Refusing to leave the property without her, he demanded she stay right by his side, suddenly stepping out to grab the bloody axe from the yard before shoving her along with the 3-month-old baby straight into a getaway vehicle. Speeding off, he drove them roughly 30 miles across the state line to his father's place in Leakesville, Mississippi. Making a handful of random stops along the way, he even dropped by another house to keep binging on drugs. Keeping his mouth shut about the slaughter the entire trip was what he did, but once they pulled up to his dad's house, reality finally started crashing down. Beginning to fade was the heavy meth high. Looking over at Lynetta and the infant, Dearman finally experienced the moment where the sheer horror of his actions clicked. Confessing everything to his father, he was immediately convinced by him that turning himself in was his only real option. Walking right into the Greene County, Mississippi Sheriff's Office on August 20th, Dearman surrendered to the deputies. Speaking directly to the huddle of reporters was something he actually did while transport officers were moving him back to Alabama. "Drugs were making me think things that's not really there," he muttered, keeping his head completely down. Sparing Lynetta and the baby was something he claimed he only did because he finally snapped out of his delusion and realized what was actually happening. Back in Citronelle, meanwhile, getting nothing but static all day Saturday was a worried relative who had been trying to get a hold of the Turners. Driving over to check on the house late that evening, they stumbled right into the butchery inside the bodies, the blood, the discarded weapons. Flooding the scene immediately, first responders blasted out an emergency bulletin for Dearman, warning the public he might be armed with knives and swords. Already sitting inside a Mississippi jail cell by the time detectives tracked his trail, he was quickly processed. Hitting him with 6 counts of capital murder were Mobile County prosecutors' 5 for the adults in the house, plus an extra charge for Chelsea Reed's unborn baby under Alabama's fetal homicide statutes. Firing his entire legal team later, he originally entered a standard not guilty plea, but eventually changed his plea to guilty, strictly requiring the state to lay out its full evidence in front of a live jury anyway was Alabama law, regardless of his confession, because it was a capital case. Sitting through every gruesome detail, the jurors stared at the horrific crime scene photos and listened to hours of graphic testimony from forensic pathologists. Recommending a sentence of death officially, they came back with a unanimous guilty verdict. Fully accepting blame, Dearman didn't fight it. Openly stating in jailhouse interviews that he was ready to give up whatever he had left to try and pay back his massive debt to society, he showed deep remorse. Insisting that the spotlight belonged on the victim's healing, not on him, he stated he knew exactly what punishment he deserved. Dropping a formal letter to the court in April 2024, he begged the state to hurry up and schedule his execution. "I am guilty," he wrote flatly. "It's not fair to the victims or their families to keep prolonging the justice that they so rightly deserve." Signing the official paperwork on September 4, 2024, was Alabama Governor Kay Ivey, setting an execution window for Derrick Dearman between midnight on October 17th and noon on October 18th. Spending time visiting with his sons, his sister, and his dad occupied Dearman in the final days counting down to the execution. Ordered from a local joint, his requested last meal was a massive seafood platter. Put to death via lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility at 6:14 p.m. On October 17th, 2024, Dearman was pronounced dead by doctors just minutes later. Releasing a statement framing the execution as a necessary step for justice and finality for the grieving families was Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall. Caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, yet were the victims' relatives. Remarking that he blamed the drugs was Bryant Randall, who lost both his daughter Chelsea and his unborn grandchild, suggesting Dearman wasn't inherently evil, but was just a man completely hollowed out by addiction. Admitting the execution felt like ripping off an old Band-Aid was Brooklyn Randall, Shannon's daughter, noting that it violently exposed deep wounds that had never truly closed up. Harboring no personal hatred toward Dearman was what other relatives insisted, though they still firmly believed the state did the right thing. Organizing emotional candlelit vigils and offering up prayers, the shaken community of Citronelle still couldn't erase the horrors of Jim Platt Road. Becoming a terrifying case study in how crystal meth can instantly weaponize a volatile personality into a mass killer was the legacy of Derrick Dearman's downward spiral. Leaving behind lingering questions about accountability and real redemption was the final chapter, especially regarding whether holding someone completely out of their mind on narcotics, fully responsible for a bloodbath they claim they can't even remember is truly just. But it also left behind lingering questions about accountability, real redemption, and whether someone completely out of their mind on narcotics can ever be held fully responsible for a bloodbath they claim they can't even remember. Giving a definitive yes was the justice system. Attempting to pick up the pieces were the remaining relatives. While 5 human lives, 6 counting that unborn baby, were permanently wiped out by one man's drug-induced madness. Not the only narcotic fueling some of Alabama's most cold-blooded executions, however, was crystal meth. Incredibly discreet and hiding right out in the open was the murder weapon in certain cases, handled by a professional trained to save lives rather than take them. Let us look at Case 7, Nikki Cappello. On September 21, 2018, in Huntsville, Alabama, Marjorie Nicole Cappello, who went by Nikki, walked into a police station to report her husband, James, missing. A prominent local private investigator who went by Jim was her spouse. Blowing up her phone were his worried colleagues, deeply anxious because he completely blew off his morning appointments, a massive red flag for a man famous for his extreme professionalism and reliability. Driving out to the couple's property on Lauderdale Road to check on his well-being, those same co-workers expected answers, but Nikki flatly blocked them from entering. Parked right there in the driveway was Jim's vehicle, but she stubbornly claimed she had zero clue where he had gone. Making a frantic phone call on September 22nd was Nikki, a move that would completely destroy her alibi. Ringing up her close friend Crystal Anderson, she confessed to something completely horrific. Dead, not just missing, was Jim. Executing him using insulin was what she admitted, and she desperately needed a hand getting rid of the corpse. Jumping back on after a brief agonizing pause while Anderson sat on the line in absolute shock, Nikki told her to just forget it. Claiming she had another buddy coming over to handle it, she hung up, but Anderson immediately dialed the authorities the moment the call ended. Rushing out to secure the property were Huntsville patrol units. Slipping into the backyard was one officer while another banged on the front door, locking down every exit. Catching a foul, unmistakable scent instantly was his nose, when the deputy out front asked Nikki to step out onto the porch to talk the heavy stench of a decomposing human body. Slapping handcuffs on her immediately was the officer's response. Spotting a small, freshly dug trench, a dirt-caked shovel tossed nearby, and a pair of caked, muddy women's shoes was the officer patrolling the backyard. Flooding the scene next were homicide detectives, the overwhelming odor growing thicker with every single step they took toward the house. Pressing Nikki for consent to search the interior was Detective Michael Danoon. Agreeing to let them look around, she grew visibly agitated but explicitly warned him to stay out of the garage. Giving the team all the probable cause they needed to lock down a search warrant was that single restriction. Stumbling upon Jim Cappello's body once inside the garage, forensics teams found it wrapped tight in a heavy plastic tarp on the floor right beside a car. Hoisted onto the floorboard already were his feet, looking exactly as if someone had been interrupted midway through loading him into the trunk. Recovered by investigators inside the main house was a stash of syringes and hypodermic needles along with a vial of insulin, a prescription drug that Nikki, despite being a registered nurse, had absolutely no legal medical reason to have in her possession. Marching straight into North Alabama Specialty Hospital in Athens, Nikki's regular workplace, detectives quickly investigated. Confirming quickly that multiple vials of insulin had mysteriously vanished from the facility was their first discovery, while coworkers recalled her venting about her marriage and claiming the only way her problems would disappear was if her husband died. Exposing a deeply fractured marriage was the paper trail. Confessed previously to his sister Jamie by Jim was his strong suspicion that Nikki had developed a massive addiction to prescription opioids after hurting her back. Noticed regularly by close friends was her nodding off at random moments, even right in the middle of family dinners. Quietly building a file on her substance abuse by utilizing his professional detective training was Jim, who even discussed putting a GPS tracker on her car. Tossing her rooms looking for stashes, he had even told his sister a chilling phrase that would haunt the family forever. "If I'm found dead, she did it." Laughing it off at the moment was Jamie, unable to comprehend that Nikki was capable of cold-blooded murder. Convinced that Nikki had been slowly, methodically poisoning her husband for weeks, however, were the prosecutors. Incredibly lethal when administered to a person who isn't diabetic is a high dose of insulin, crashing blood sugar levels so violently that it triggers extreme confusion, blackouts, total organ shutdown, and a slow, agonizing death. Barely leaving a visible puncture mark are the tiny microneedles used, and virtually impossible for a medical examiner to trace, is the chemical signature of insulin the moment a corpse begins to decay. And the moment a corpse begins to decay, the chemical signature of insulin becomes virtually impossible for a medical examiner to trace. Pilfering the insulin from her hospital ward for weeks and smuggling it home vial by vial was almost certainly Nikki's method. Scrambling when cornered by investigators, she claimed she had merely brought a bottle home by accident, an alibi nobody bought for a second. Decomposing in that stuffy garage for days before the police finally uncovered it was Jim's corpse, making it impossible for the coroner to lock down a definitive medical cause of death. Trying to exploit this forensic blind spot later at trial was Nikki's legal team. Having a mountain of eyewitness testimony instead, prosecutors didn't actually need a medical autopsy to prove their case. Relying on Nikki's own incriminating confession to Crystal Anderson, the stolen insulin she had no business possessing, and the stash of syringes, the state built a powerful argument, presenting the shallow trench in the backyard, colleagues testifying she wanted Jim out of the picture, and a rock-solid motive. The prosecution team advanced confidently, desperate for a divorce, convinced Jim was stepping out on her, and terrified of losing total custody of their 4-year-old daughter if Jim exposed her secret drug addiction to a judge. Nikki felt cornered. Arresting Nikki on September 24, 2018, deputies booked her for murder, though she managed to secure her release that very night after posting a $100,000 bond. Indicting her for reckless murder in 2019 was the grand jury's initial action. Going back to secure an upgraded charge of intentional murder by 2021, prosecutors argued that the freshly uncovered evidence pointed to cold, calculated premeditation, Following endless delays triggered by the global pandemic and various scheduling conflicts, her trial was repeatedly pushed back. Kicking off finally in May 2022, the trial featured 15 separate prosecution witnesses over 4 intense days. Not putting a single soul on the stand was the choice of Nikki's defense team, gambling everything on the argument that without a solid medical cause of death, the state couldn't even prove a homicide had occurred, was her attorney, Brian White. Stressing heavily that insulin degrades rapidly and leaves zero trace in a decomposing body after a few days, he argued this reality created massive, reasonable doubt. Countering that the circumstantial trail told the real story, however, were prosecutor Shay Keller and District Attorney Tim Duthett. When you announce you're going to execute your husband with insulin, when you get caught red-handed with insulin, when the man drops dead with all the hallmarks of an insulin overdose, and when you brag to a friend that you killed him with insulin, the coroner's cause of death becomes completely irrelevant under Alabama law. Taking just over 30 minutes to return a verdict, the jury walked out and quickly reached a decision. Pronouncing her guilty of intentional murder was the result of their brief deliberation. Sitting perfectly frozen, Nikki stared blankly ahead as the decision was read, prompting Circuit Judge Alan Mann to schedule sentencing for July 14, 2022, was the high-profile conviction. Remaining completely stoic at that final hearing, Nikki listened as Judge Mann officially handed her a sentence of life in prison. Weeping with a profound sense of relief were Jim's relatives, who had spent every single day of the trial wearing custom shirts reading "Justice for Jimmy" and "Prayers and Hope for Riley." Knowing there was no celebration to be found, they quietly exited the courtroom. Telling reporters that true closure was a myth was Jim's father, especially since little Riley, now under the care of Jim's sister, Jamie would have to grow up without a mother or a father. Filing immediately for a retrial, Nikki's lawyers claimed the conviction was built on flimsy guesswork and that the state had failed to establish the basic legal proof of a crime. Shooting down the challenge in March 23 the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals certified both the conviction and the life term. Firing off a secondary appeal, Nikki saw that attempt also flatly denied. Leaving her locked away for the duration of her natural life within the Alabama prison system was the final outcome. Launching a civil wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of young Riley, meanwhile, was attorney Will League, fighting for financial restitution over the theft of her father's life. Legally locking away every single dollar recovered to fund her future upbringing was the primary goal of the litigation. Standing as a haunting reminder that real-world monsters rarely dress the part is this tragic saga. Weaponizing her medical expertise to end a life instead was a registered nurse and a mother, a professional bound by oath to protect life. Seasoned private eye Jim Cappello was a man who made his living dragging dark secrets out into the light. Unraveling his own wife's plot to murder him was, tragically, the very last conspiracy he managed to expose. Running out of time to escape, he could not avoid the fatal trap. Not the only person in Alabama whose investigation into a loved one would culminate in a horrific crime scene was Jim, however. Let us look at Case 8. Ibrahim Yazid, over in Auburn, where a college student's everyday act of kindness was about to spiral into a public nightmare, exposing the catastrophic failure of the state's entire bail system. Standing out as a completely ordinary Wednesday evening on October 23, 2019, in Auburn, Alabama, was the last night anyone saw Anaya Blanchard, a 19-year-old student at Southern Union State Community College. Going about her usual routine, she navigated the evening hours without any suspicion of danger. Dropping her brother Elijah off at his apartment right around 11 p.m., she quickly shot her roommate, Sarah O'Brien, a Snapchat message stating she was almost back home. Claiming she was hanging out with a guy named Eric someone, she had apparently just met another message, was fired off at 11:40 p.m. Placing her at a nearby apartment complex was her live location, which broadcasted directly through her phone. Assuming Anaya was just chilling out with friends, Sarah naturally didn't worry further. Becoming terrifyingly obvious by the next morning, however, was the fact that something went horribly wrong. Never walking through the door was Anaya, prompting her family to grow increasingly frantic as her phone went completely dead. Formally reported missing on October 24th, she became the subject of an intense search before her Honda CR-V was recovered the very next day, dumped at a Montgomery apartment complex. Sitting a full 55 miles away from Auburn was the vehicle, which sported fresh scrape damage running all along the passenger side. Hitting a massive pool of blood inside the car, forensic teams uncovered a volume so significant that analysts openly stated it was indicative of someone suffering a catastrophic, life-threatening injury. Sending an icy shiver through the entire task force was this grim discovery. No longer considered a runaway teenager case, the investigation shifted focus because Anaya Blanchard was clearly in extreme, immediate danger. Putting together a chilling timeline quickly was security camera footage pulled from a Chevron gas station in Auburn. Catching Anaya inside the convenience store around 11:20 p.m. on October 23rd, the tape revealed her final known movements. Standing inside that very same store at that exact moment was a man detectives would later identify as Ibrahim Yazid. Recorded buying items while constantly cutting his eyes over in Anaya's direction, he was clearly tracking her before exterior footage later captured him stepping out of the passenger side of Anaya's vehicle and climbing right back inside. Pulling away from the pumps together, they drove off, but an eyewitness who was parked at the station that night soon came forward with an even more horrifying piece of the puzzle. Watching Yazid physically overpower Anaya, the witness claimed he saw him force her into her own car before they sped off into the night. Telling his buddy immediately what he had just seen, the witness sought a second opinion. Advised by his friend to just mind his own business and keep moving, he didn't call the tip line until days later. Carrying a massively violent and extensive rap sheet was Ibrahim Yazid, a 30-year-old native of Montgomery. Allegedly ambushing and pistol-whipping two men inside a hotel room just months earlier in January 2019, he and three accomplices left a trail of brutality. Leaving a 77-year-old victim completely unconscious and clinging to life, Yazid was slapped with charges of kidnapping, attempted murder, and first-degree robbery. Trying to execute two police officers in 2012 by ramming his vehicle into their cruiser, along with an aggravated battery on a law enforcement officer back in 2017, were just parts of his violent history. Allowing Yazid to walk free on a $295,000 bond despite the sheer brutality of those pending counts was a decision handed down by a judge. Actively roaming the streets as a free man when Anaya Blanchard vanished, he was a ticking time bomb. Blasting out a surveillance snapshot of a person of interest on November 6, 2019, Auburn police pushed for public help. Formally identifying that face as Yazid by the very next day, authorities acted swiftly. Drawn up immediately for first-degree kidnapping was an arrest warrant, which sent the U.S. Marshals down to Pensacola, Florida, following a hot tip. Tracking his trail down near Interstate 10 was the Florida Regional Fugitive Task Force. Bolting on foot into the brush the moment he spotted the heat, Yazid ignored every single command to freeze. Wrestling him physically out of his hiding spot, marshals cuffed him and rushed him through extradition back to Alabama, where he was thrown into the Lee County Detention Facility, locked away with absolutely no bond. Pushing forward while Yazid sat behind bars was the desperate search for Anaya. Stumbling upon human remains hidden in a thick wooded stretch of Macon County, Alabama, on November 25, 2019, search teams halted. Sitting right along the highway between Auburn and Montgomery was the site, and dental records officially confirmed the worst 2 days later. The remains belonged to Anaya Blanchard. Revealed by an autopsy to have been killed by a direct gunshot wound, her death was formally ruled a homicide. Absolutely shattering her family, the tragic news crushed her stepfather, prominent UFC fighter Walt Harris, alongside her mother Angela Harris, who had been desperately clinging to any shred of hope. Tearing up the kidnapping charges on December 2, 2019, state prosecutors officially upgraded Yazid's indictment to capital murder. Going public to announce that the state would aggressively pursue the death penalty was Lee County District Attorney Brandon Hughes. Emphasizing that investigators had firmly established Yazid as the sole person responsible for Anaya's abduction and violent death, Hughes drew a hard line. Wrapped up in the conspiracy under separate criminal charges by detectives, however, were two other individuals. Slapped with a kidnapping charge for allegedly providing transportation to Yazid and helping him systematically destroy evidence was 35-year-old Antoine Squirmy Fisher. Charged with hindering prosecution after lying straight to police about his own son driving Yazid out of Alabama to Florida was 63-year-old David Johnson, Jr. Exposing even more chilling details were freshly unsealed court documents. Informing police that they ran into Yazid at a Montgomery home was an anonymous witness who noted he was wearing nothing but gym shorts with a handgun tucked into his waistband. Possessing Anaya's vehicle but adamantly refusing to let anyone look inside or see her was Yazid, according to the witness, bragging allegedly during that brief interaction that he shot a girl because she lunged for the weapon. Yazid confirmed that Anaya fought like hell to save her own life. Blowing up completely any defense theory that the shooting was an accident was this statement, proving Yazid had hunted her down, driven her to a remote location, and executed her the moment she resisted. Handing down a 3-count capital murder indictment against Yazid in November 2022 was a Macon County grand jury. Included were 1 count for murder during a first-degree kidnapping, 1 count for murder during a first-degree robbery for stealing her vehicle and cell phone, and a final count for committing a homicide while the victim was inside a vehicle. Personally laying out the state's case to the grand jury for 10 straight days before locking in the indictment was Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall. Standing before a judge in March 2023, Yazid entered a flat plea of not guilty to every single count. Officially scheduled for March 2nd, 20-6, was his high-stakes trial, with jury selection kicking off that very morning, but extending far beyond the courtroom boundaries was Anaya's legacy, as her tragic passing ignited an absolute political revolution. Triggering absolute fury among Alabama citizens and lawmakers was the horrifying reality that Yazid had been roaming the community on bond while facing active kidnapping and attempted murder charges. Spearheading the movement alongside her mother Angela was Anaya's family, launching a massive public campaign pushing for Anaya's law, a landmark constitutional amendment designed to give state judges and prosecutors sweeping authority to deny bail to dangerous, violent suspects. Legally guaranteeing the right to bail for practically all criminal defendants for generations was Alabama's constitution, making an exclusive exception only for those staring down capital charges. Legally forced to hand him a bond was the court because Yazid's pending counts kidnapping and attempted murder did not qualify as capital offenses at the time. Seeking to completely rewrite those rules was Anaya's law, expanding the no-bail exceptions to encompass severe, violent offenses like kidnapping, rape, robbery, domestic violence, aggravated child abuse, first-degree assault, human trafficking, sodomy, sexual torture, terrorism, and non-capital murder. Demanding an emergency hearing to revoke bail under this revamped framework was a new power granted to prosecutors, giving judges the full legal discretion to lock suspects away based on the state's evidence. Put directly to Alabama voters on the general election ballot on November 8, 2022, was the historic amendment, passing by an absolute landslide, a clear testament to how deeply Anaya's tragedy resonated across the entire state. Bringing a bittersweet sense of justice for Anaya's grieving parents was the legislative victory, neither bringing their vibrant daughter back home nor erasing the absolute agony of having to identify her remains by the distinct sorrel boots. Walt had bought her during a special family vacation to New York City. Could this victory achieve? Taking comfort knowing it would lock away predators before they could force another family through the exact same living nightmare, they found some peace. Transforming her grief into a powerful platform was Angela Harris, who became a fierce advocate for victims' rights, speaking at national forums, keeping Anaya's memory alive, and breaking down systemic legal flaws, while openly sharing his heartbreak with the world was Walt Harris, remembering his stepdaughter as an incredibly sweet, loving, and radiant soul. Becoming the universal symbol for the urgent fight over bail reform across the Deep South was Anaya Blanchard's face. Echoing through true crime podcasts, primetime news specials, and a major 48 Hours investigative documentary was her story, mapping out how a simple, mundane evening errand just dropping off her brother led to a fatal ambush by a violent repeat offender who should have never been allowed on the streets. High-definition surveillance tapes, damning witness confessions, and a trail of forensic evidence ultimately left zero doubt about the horrific timeline of abduction, terror, and murder. Officially going to a jury in March 2026 was Ibrahim Yazid's trial, while initial records suggested he would spend late 2025 waiting on a courtroom date. Aggressively fighting for capital convictions were the prosecutors, but the jury ultimately found him guilty of the lesser charges of murder and felony murder for the death of Anaya Blanchard, officially taking the death penalty off the table on May 7, 2026. A judge sentenced Yazid to spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. Left carrying the permanent weight of their losses are the families of Anaya Blanchard and the other victims broken by Yazid's violent history, though the sentence closed a dark chapter. Continuing to walk the delicate, highly tense line between preserving a defendant's presumption of innocence and locking down public safety is Alabama's legal system, fundamentally transformed by the sweeping passage of Anaya's law. Just 19 years old was Anaya Blanchard, a young woman with a vibrant, limitless life stretching out ahead of her. Stripping all of that away in an instant was one chance encounter at a local gas station with a violent repeat offender roaming free on bond. Yet even as the collective outrage over Anaya's law aimed to lock down future tragedies, another horrific Alabama nightmare was already quietly playing out in the background. Proving youth to be absolutely no barrier to cold, stomach-churning violence, this was a case where a family's peaceful morning routine would culminate in unimaginable horror. Let us move to Case 9. Landon, Durham. January 21, 2020. Standing as a tight-knit, sleepy town tucked away in Talladega County is Munford, Alabama, where neighbors spent generations looking out for one another, and young kids walked to school without a single ounce of fear. Right around 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, while the vast majority of Munford was sound asleep, 16-year-old Landon Durham allegedly began slipping through his family's home on Roy Lackey Lane. Guided by cold, meticulously deadly intent, he moved silently through the dark house. His 36-year-old mother, Holy Christina Durham, alongside his 13-year-old twin brothers, Branson and Barron, were his primary targets. Brutally stabbed to death while lying trapped in their own beds was every single one of them. Crawling right back into his own bed and going back to sleep, according to stunned investigators, was Landon's next move. Getting up with the sun a mere few hours later, he dressed himself and calmly walked right into Munford High School as if it were a perfectly normal Tuesday. Suspecting a thing was not a single soul at the school. Sitting through his morning classes, quietly navigating the crowded hallways, and completing his schoolwork was his routine. Catching not a single unusual glitch in his behavior were his teachers, who later reported that he was quiet, certainly, but that was just his typical personality. Having absolutely no way of knowing that less than a mile down the road, 3 bloody corpses lay cold inside a family home, were those educators. Spending the entirety of Tuesday desperately trying to get in touch with Holly and the young twins was an anxious relative back at the house. Ringing out into silence was every single phone call, and completely ignored went every frantic text message. Escalating into pure panic by the time evening rolled around, mild worry prompted the relative to drive straight over to the property to check in. Permanently scarring the town of Munford for generations was what they discovered past the front door. Savage in its execution, the scene left Holly, Branson, and Barron Durham stabbed a brutal number of times, proving the killer acted with pure, unbridled executioner's intent. Screaming into a 911 call immediately was the horrified relative. Flooding the property and instantly confirming the worst-case scenario were Talladega County Sheriff's deputies. 3 family members were dead, and completely missing from the home was the eldest son. Realizing Landon Durham was entirely unaccounted for, investigators immediately put 2 and 2 together. Blasted out to all surrounding law enforcement networks was a critical lookout bulletin, heavily warning officers that the teenager could be heavily armed with an arsenal of knives and swords. Surging through the overnight hours was the frantic manhunt. Spotting Landon steering a vehicle down County Road 71 near County Road 38 on Wednesday morning, January 22nd, at roughly 7:45 a.m., were sharp Cherokee County Sheriff's deputies. Cutting straight toward Etowah County was his path. Flashing their lights, deputies pulled him over into a store parking lot directly across from the Beans and Greens restaurant, where he was cuffed without a fight. Remaining entirely unclear was where he had spent the night or exactly what destination he was fleeing toward. Simply giving up, he offered no resistance. Stepping in front of a wall of microphones at a press conference to verify the community's absolute darkest fear was Talladega County District Attorney Steve Giddens. Landon Durham is the person who committed the crimes. Giddens stated flatly to the cameras. He was arrested today. Dropping a chilling detail next, the DA noted that detectives believed the triple homicide went down right around 3 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Profoundly unsettling was the chronological breakdown. Butchering his mother and siblings in the pitch black, casually going back to get some rest, enduring a full 6-hour school day, and then successfully playing hide-and-seek with the law overnight before being cornered, was the chilling timeline Landon allegedly completed. Leaving veteran homicide detectives utterly speechless was the sheer psychopathic level of calm required to pull off that timeline. Standing at that same media briefing, Talladega County Chief Deputy Joshua Tubbs openly labeled the massacre one of the worst things I've ever seen in his entire 19-year law enforcement career. Deliberately holding back the most graphic details from the public, he still made the reality clear through his grim expression. Absolutely catastrophic was the level of overkill and sheer violence unleashed upon Holly, Branson, and Barron. Informing reporters that he didn't have a definitive motive he could openly discuss with the public was Giddens, though later court records would heavily drop hints regarding escalating family friction and behavioral issues. Pushed automatically into the adult court system under Alabama statutes was Landon, because he had already turned 16 and the charges amounted to capital murder. Slapped with multiple counts of capital murder, specifically triggered by the slaughter of more than one person during a single criminal incident, the teenager faced an incredibly grim legal reality. Insulated entirely from facing the death penalty due to his legal status as a minor at the precise moment of the offense, Landon nevertheless faced severe consequences. Imposing a maximum penalty of life in prison with absolutely zero eligibility for parole was the most the court could possibly do if a jury handed down a conviction. Left completely broken by the tragedy was the tiny community of Munford. Pulling in several hundred grieving residents, a massive prayer vigil was organized 2 days later at Munford Baptist Church. Barely choking out their words through heavy tears were close relatives of the victims, with one relative, Jennifer Harrison, openly begging the community to pray for supernatural strength, wishing for the victims to find peace in a better place, and praying that Landon might somehow find his way out of the darkness. Reflecting perfectly the tight-knit, faith-based community's desperate attempt to process the unexplainable, it stood as a remarkably graceful, compassionate sentiment under such horrific circumstances. Stepping forward to handle the crisis was Talladega County School Superintendent, Suzanne Lacey, releasing an official statement acknowledging the immense weight of the tragedy and its deep ripple effects through the hallways. Like any small town, when tragedy strikes, it affects the entire community, including the school community, she noted. Our focus is to support the school family during this difficult time. We have additional counselors available to provide a helping hand and listening ear to our Munford students and staff. Locked in officially for February 28, 2020, was Landon's preliminary hearing, a crucial date where a judge would review the files to decide if the state had enough evidence to push the case to a full trial. Ordered held inside a cell with absolutely no option for bond, he remained isolated until June 2021, when, filing a formal motion requesting the court grant him youthful offender status were Landon's defense attorneys, a legal maneuver that would have completely erased a public jury trial, permanently sealed all criminal records, and capped his maximum prison time at a mere 3 years if convicted. Denying the defense's request flatly was Circuit Judge William Hollingsworth. Entering twin pleas of not guilty and not guilty by reason of mental defect subsequently, Landon set up a high-stakes legal showdown designed to heavily scrutinize his exact psychiatric state during the stabbings. Continuing to grind, slowly were the legal gears while Landon Durham remained locked away in custody, as attorneys fought through a series of lengthy delays fueled by complex legal motions and procedural bottlenecks. Haunting every single resident who continues to look for answers, however, is simply the burning question: why? Possessing a 16-year-old boy to slaughter his own mother and young twin brothers must have been a powerful force, leaving people to wonder if it was a cold, calculated plot, a sudden, catastrophic mental health break, or a hidden history of domestic abuse behind closed doors that finally pushed him past the breaking point. Keeping their cards completely hidden, state prosecutors have stated strictly that the full weight of the evidence will speak for itself once the trial opens. Documented clearly in the records is that Holly Durham was newly engaged to be married, actively building a bright, fresh future for herself and her kids. Navigating middle school with their entire lives, stretched out ahead of them were Branson and Barron, who were only 13 years old. Showing nothing but smiling faces were happy family portraits uploaded to social media accounts, a proud mother posing with her boys, looking like a perfectly normal household. Warning of the horrific bloodbath to come were absolutely no public red flags. Continuing to ignite uncomfortable debates surrounding the juvenile justice system is this tragic case. Can a 16-year-old mind truly grasp the permanent, devastating reality of wiping out 3 human lives? Right, fundamentally, is it to sentence a teenager to draw his very last breath inside a prison cell without ever offering a shot at parole? Arguing heavily that adolescent brains are still actively developing, that children possess a unique capacity for rehabilitation, and that throwing away the key completely ignores both modern science and basic humanity, are juvenile reform advocates. Countering that certain acts of violence are so uniquely monstrous that the killer's age becomes entirely irrelevant are retribution advocates, insisting that innocent society must be protected at all costs, and that absolute justice for the victims must always outweigh second chances for murderer. Remaining an open book for now is Landon Durham's legal saga. Taking their seats eventually will be a jury, the graphic files will be displayed, and a final verdict will be reached. Wreaking permanent damage that has already been done, however, the horror remains for the shattered residents of Munford. Gone forever are 3 innocent people. Completely pulverized is a small town's sense of absolute safety, and sitting inside a jail cell, accused of systematically wiping out his entire family in the dead of night, is a teenage boy. Butchering his family in the middle of the night before casually walking into his high school classes the next morning like it was just another ordinary day, Landon completed a terrifying sequence. Unleashed sometimes by the very people we are supposed to trust implicitly, our own family, our closest neighbors, and the institutional systems explicitly designed to protect our lives, are the most bone-chilling, terrifying acts of violence. Learning painfully from this final case that sometimes the ultimate injustice isn't just the execution of the crime itself, but the agonizing aftermath that unfolds when an entirely innocent person is forced to pay the price for it, were Alabama residents. Standing as a stark reminder of systemic failure is this final chapter, presenting Case 10. Topherus Johnson, the man the state of Alabama may have completely, wrongfully convicted on July 19, 1995. Pulling a security shift at a local hotel in Birmingham, Alabama, somewhere between 12:30 and 1 o'clock a.m., off-duty Jefferson County Deputy Sheriff William G. Hardy was suddenly ambushed, shot twice, and killed right in the parking lot. Leaving behind a completely shattered family and a local community boiling with outrage over the cold-blooded murder of one of their own lawmen was the 49-year-old veteran officer. Twisting into one of the most polarizing and heavily contested wrongful conviction cases in modern Alabama history, however, was the chaotic investigation that immediately followed. Pulling over a vehicle at a motel situated several miles away from the active crime scene that very same night, right around 4 o'clock in the morning, were patrol officers. Huddled inside the car were 4 young African-American individuals. Included among them were 22-year-old Topherus Johnson, his 21-year-old paraplegic companion Ardrigus Ford, and 2 young women named Latanya Henderson and Yolanda Chambers. Detained immediately and subjected to aggressive interrogation, the group faced intense scrutiny. Lacking any real hard evidence to lock in charges at that exact moment, homicide investigators were temporarily stuck. Going completely ice-cold for weeks was the high-profile case, until the state finally announced the exact break prosecutors had been desperately praying for. Stepping suddenly forward into the spotlight, right after the state publicly slapped a $5,000 cash reward on the table for any actionable leads, was a local woman named Violet Ellison. Spinning a tale claiming her daughter was actively dating an inmate locked up in the county jail and would regularly patch through 3-way phone calls for him, Ellison caught the attention of detectives. Picking up the receiver casually during one of these patched conversations, Ellison asserted that she heard vital information. Distinctly overhearing a man who explicitly introduced himself as Topherus openly confessing to pulling the trigger on Deputy Hardy, she provided prosecutors with their primary weapon, Taking her story a step further, she claimed the voice on the line stated that a man named Quintus Wilson was the accomplice who fired off the second shot. Existing with her claim was just one massive glaring problem. Definitive ballistics testing proved that both fatal bullets were fired from the exact same firearm, meaning there was only ever one lone shooter. Clashing fundamentally with the hard physical evidence on the ground was Ellison's blockbuster story. Pushing forward aggressively with the narrative anyway was the district attorney's office. Putting Ardrigus Ford on trial first, long before Topher S. Johnson ever sat at a defense table, prosecutors established their initial framework. Presenting a completely contradictory, conflicting theory of the crime inside Ford's courtroom, the state shifted its approach, staking their entire case on the shaky testimony of Yolanda Chambers, who swore under oath that she personally watched Ford execute Deputy Hardy. Prosecutors forged ahead. Acknowledging openly to the courtroom that Chambers had caught herself in numerous lies in the past, prosecutors nevertheless adamantly doubled down that she was telling the absolute truth this time around. Taking the stand to testify that he fully believed Ford spun his wheelchair around, whipped out a 9mm handgun, and unleashed the fatal rounds was the lead detective. Collapsing ultimately into a mistrial, Ford's dramatic trial ended with the jury deadlocked 10-2 heavily in favor of a total acquittal. Opening its first trial against Topher S. Johnson just 1 month later, the state completely flipped their narrative on its head. Abandoning completely the theory that Ford was the trigger man, they pivoted to argue that Johnson was actually the lone wolf who fired the fatal shots. Resting almost exclusively on Violet Ellison's uncorroborated testimony regarding the eavesdropped phone conversation was the state's entire prosecution. Tying Johnson to the hotel parking lot was absolutely zero physical evidence, and not a single eyewitness could place him anywhere near the scene of the crime. Bringing forward more than 10 credible alibi witnesses in stark contrast, the defense presented a powerful counter-argument as everyone testified under oath that Johnson was across town hanging out at a nightclub when the shooting went down. Fracturing into a swift mistrial because the jury simply couldn't reach a unanimous consensus on his guilt was Johnson's premier trial as well. Dragging Johnson into a second trial in 1998, undeterred prosecutors trotted out yet another brand new theory of the murder. Painting a picture this time that Johnson and an unnamed accomplice tag-teamed the killing, the state adapted its presentation. Shifting like sand was the state's narrative, but firmly anchored remained one singular element: Violet Ellison's damning testimony. Working effectively this time, the strategy resulted in the jury convicting Johnson and officially sentencing him to die by lethal injection. Marched straight onto Alabama's death row, he has languished there for more than a quarter of a century, though intense skepticism over his conviction has never truly quieted down. Uncovering a deeply disturbing buried secret in 2015, however, was Johnson's dedicated legal appeals team, who discovered that Violet Ellison had been quietly cut a check for the $5,000 reward money immediately following her testimony, a critical fact prosecutors illegally hid from both the defense and the jury, constituting a blatant violation of constitutional Brady rules, which legally mandate that the state must hand over all deals or incentives offered to witnesses, was the failure to disclose this financial agreement. Casting a dark shadow over Ellison's overall credibility immediately was the secret transaction. Surging steadily over the subsequent decades, a massive groundswell of support demanding a new trial has raised serious doubts. Breaking rank and going public to demand a retrial was Jeff Wallace, the actual lead prosecutor who initially secured Johnson's conviction, stating flatly that he no longer believes the guilty verdict can legally or morally stand. Launching his own exhaustive internal review of the case files was Jefferson County District Attorney Danny Carr, before officially stepping forward to file a legal brief backing Johnson's demands for a fresh trial. Concluding bluntly that the state's original evidence had completely unraveled over the last 20 years was Carr, who stated that the foundational integrity of the entire conviction had dissolved into nothing. Locking arms to loudly demand that Johnson finally receive a fair day in court was a stunning coalition of 3 former Alabama Supreme Court justices, 2 former governors, multiple former state attorneys general, and dozens of top-tier legal scholars. Flooding the docket by 2021 were 7 different amicus briefs in support of Johnson, an unprecedented, historic mobilization across Birmingham's legal, faith, and civil rights communities. Joining the fray was the National Innocence Project, submitting extensive briefs that labeled the case a textbook example of a catastrophic wrongful conviction. Adding their names to the rising chorus were legendary former Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley and former Chief Justice Drayton Nabors. Signing onto the formal petitions were prominent criminal defense attorneys hailing from Birmingham, Montgomery, Tuscaloosa, and Mobile, while influential religious leaders added their moral authority to the fight. Agreeing that a horrific miscarriage of justice had occurred was practically every single legal and moral authority in the state, with the sole exception of the Alabama Attorney General's office. Stepping in to officially shoot down Johnson's petition for a new trial, however, was Jefferson County Circuit Judge Candace Pettit, defying the massive wave of support. Ruling that the defense had legally failed to prove its explicit claims of structural prosecutorial misconduct was the judge, who declared that Johnson was procedurally blocked from launching a second post-conviction appeal. Filing a wave of fresh petitions quickly were Johnson's appellate attorneys, who were unwilling to back down. Utilizing District Attorney Carr's formal findings as vital, newly uncovered evidence that legally demanded a full reconsideration, the defense renewed its push. Pushing directly into 2026, the legal battle saw those critical petitions remaining heavily deadlocked in the appellate court system. Becoming the core focus of the award-winning investigative podcast Ear Witness, hosted by seasoned journalist Beth Shelburne, was the stunning breakdown of the state's case. Spending years systematically dismantling every single shred of information surrounding Johnson's long-standing conviction, Shelburne exposed glaring factual inconsistencies, highly manipulative police tactics, and a rigid judicial system that appeared far more obsessed with keeping a file permanently closed than actually tracking down the truth. Sitting down with every key player left on the board, including the primary homicide detective, the original prosecutor, and Violet Ellison herself, the journalist performed a deep-dive investigation. Exposing completely what critics frequently call a carefully manufactured illusion of justice was the podcast. Standing behind the legal paperwork as a real father, a son, and a beloved brother is Topher S. Johnson. Born, raised, and rooted in the heart of Birmingham was Johnson, whose daughter, Shania Poole, affectionately known to her family as Akaria or Muffin, has spent years fighting for him across social media platforms. Publishing his letters from death row regularly and documenting their painful prison visits, she kept his plight in the public eye. Waging a relentless war for his absolute freedom for well over a quarter of a century, his family has fiercely maintained his complete innocence. Highlighting continuously the 10 rock-solid alibi witnesses, they refuse to let the case be forgotten. Pointing straight to the total lack of physical or forensic evidence and spotlighting the state's ever-shifting chameleonic prosecution theories, they build a compelling counter-narrative. Continuing to ask through it all is one simple, devastating question. How can a man remain trapped on death row when the very prosecutor who put him there now publicly states he is innocent? Launching aggressive legal opposition against granting a new trial, however, is the state of Alabama, fiercely anchored by current Attorney General Steve Marshall. Maintaining a hardline stance that Johnson already had his fair day in front of a jury is Marshall's office, pointing out that his previous historic appeals were formally denied and insisting that the state courts have already settled these questions permanently. Countering that the suppressed financial payment to Ellison, combined with the original prosecutor's profound change of heart, more than justifies a fresh look, is Johnson's massive network of supporters. Marking now over 25 agonizing years on Alabama's death row for a capital crime he maintains he had absolutely nothing to do with is Topher Johnson. Navigating his 50s today, he was a 22-year-old young man when the handcuffs first snapped shut. Spent trapped inside a concrete cell waiting on an executioner has been far more than half of his entire existence on this earth, all for a homicide that multiple eyewitnesses swear he could not have physically committed. Standing as one of the most monstrous and egregious systemic failures in the history of the Alabama justice system, if he is truly an innocent man, is his conviction, meaning that more than a dozen ordinary citizens committed mass perjury to protect him if he is somehow guilty. The alternative scenario is equally shocking. suggesting that state prosecutors somehow stumbled into the correct culprit despite changing their core theory of the crime 5 different times. Proving wrong every legal expert calling for a new trial is the alternative conclusion. Locked behind years of legal procedures, sealed records, and a system reluctant to admit mistakes remains the truth, whatever it is. Deserving justice is the family of Deputy William Hardy. Knowing the person responsible for his death is being held accountable is what they truly deserve. Paying the price if the wrong person is convicted means justice is not justice at all. Standing at the center of the case of Topherus Johnson is not the question of whether a crime occurred. Wondering whether Alabama has the right man or whether an innocent person has been on death row for a quarter century while the real killer walked free is the true haunting dilemma. Continuing to fight as Johnson's legal team presses forward, one thing becomes clear while advocacy groups rally support and more voices join the call for a new trial. Standing at a critical crossroads is Alabama's justice system. Correcting a potential wrongful conviction will be its chosen path, or will it choose a different way? Executing a man despite overwhelming doubt would be a catastrophic alternative, defining not just Topherus Johnson's fate, but the integrity of Alabama's courts for generations to come will be the ultimate answer. Unfolding in the near future, that decision will shape the history of the state's legal framework forever.